empty room with no air circulation. Nate walked to the center of the room and stopped. The side of the room from which they'd entered had only one door, but the opposite side of the room had 6. 2 of those were bathrooms. He could see the dust-covered men's room sign hanging from a single screw next to one of the rooms. But the other 4 doors could lead, well, anywhere. He looked from one to the other, and had no idea which one to take. He was about to ask Sylvia which way, when one of the doors fell open with the groan of seldom-used hinges. They all flinched. A girl child stepped through the door, leaving it open behind her. She looked to be 9 or maybe 10. She was shabbily dressed in a tattered yellow dress, no shoes, her hair a wild tangle on her head. Her arms hung limply at her side, and from one hooked finger depended a plastic bag filled with half a loaf of bread and some oranges. She shuffled across the floor, one leg obviously injured. "Stand back," Richardson said, pushing his way past Nate. He drew his pistol and leveled it at the little girl. "No," said Sylvia. She stepped forward, put a hand on Richardson's arm, and eased his weapon down. "Look at her," she said. Nate did. The left side of the girl's face was all chewed up, but it had been cleaned and had already started to heal. The eye on that side of her face was ruined. The other eye was webbed with white lines, like incipient cataracts. She made her slow, shuffling way across the trash-covered floor, and for just a moment turned her one good eye toward Nate. There was a haunted, uneasy vacancy in the back of her stare. But the girl didn't stop. She kept going across the room, fumbled at a doorknob with a hand that didn't seem to work just right, and finally got it open. The next instant she was gone. Richardson had taken a few cautious steps after her, but now he turned and looked at the rest of them. What was that? Why didn't she attack? Why didn't she start moaning? Nate shrugged. Avery grabbed Nate's hand. "I don't like that," she said. "That's not right." "No," Sylvia said. "No, it's not." "Anybody want to take a crack at what the hell we just saw?" Richardson said. Sylvia said, "I think we should go after her." "What?" "It looked like she was being led, didn't it?" Richardson shook his head, scowling like her suggestion was utter lunacy. But it made sense to Nate. Once again he sensed his thoughts coming together. Something had clicked for him. "It did look like that," he said. He nodded to himself. "Yes." Then, to Avery. "She was carrying food. That was what was in the bag, right? Food?" "Yeah," Avery said. "So who was it for?" Nate said. Richardson shook his head. Nate frowned at him. It wasn't like Richardson to miss something that seemed so obvious. But he either couldn't or wouldn't understand. "We need to follow her," Sylvia said. "I bet she'll lead us to Nikki." "Exactly," Nate said. "That's crazy," Richardson said. "Ben," Sylvia said. "She was being led, directed. The red man is controlling her. You have to see that, don't you?" "No, I don't." "Why do you find it so hard to believe? You yourself told me you've seen Stage 3 zombies using Stage 1 zombies like hunting dogs to flush out prey. How is this any different?" "Because there's a physical agency involved in the way Stage 3 zombies control the lesser ones. They're exactly like hunters with their dogs. They point them where they want them to go, and they let native instincts take over. What you're suggesting would take some kind of psychic power. I refuse to believe that." "But why?" "Because it's not rationally consistent." "I don't even know what that's supposed to mean." "It doesn't make sense. These are zombies, Sylvia. Zombies. Their minds have been cooked to mush by the necrosis filovirus until there's nothing left. They have no intellect, no consciousness. They don't make plans. They don't play puppeteer with other zombies. And you know why? Because there's nothing for a puppeteer to hook his strings to. You can't control a mind that isn't there. Sylvia just stared at him. He huffed back. These are zombies, Sylvia, he said again. When you start giving them psychic powers, or whatever the hell you claim this is, they stop being zombies. They become something else. And that's just not consistent with this world. I don't see how that makes any of this less real, she said. Enough, Nate said. He went over to the door and looked down the hallway. The little girl was slipping around the corner at the far end. We're going to lose her if we stick around here arguing. He's right, Sylvia said to Richardson. She took Avery by the hand. Come on, sweetie. Let's go get Nicky. They slipped past Nate at the doorway. He pointed them down the hall. She went around that corner, he said. Nate turned to Richardson, who was standing in the middle of the empty room, looking frustrated and dour. You coming? Nate said. Chapter 19. They followed the little girl, but stayed well back in the shadows. Far enough away, Nate hoped anyway, that they could turn tail and run if it came to that. But the girl seemed to be the only thing moving through the hotel. She went from one hallway to the next, winding her slow and steady way through the maze of passageways, never once getting lost, like she was following an old familiar path. Nate got bored again. His head felt soupy from the heat, which was becoming oppressive the deeper they went. He smelled bad, too. Several times he tried to drive the cloying mustiness of the river out of his nostrils by shaking his head, but the smell enveloped him like a living thing. He couldn't tell if the others smelled as bad as he did. Probably they did, but they were definitely feeling the heat. He could tell from the labored sound of Richardson's breathing, and from the way Sylvia had given up trying to push the hair from her face. It was an unaccustomed look for her. In the week or so he'd been running around with this group, he'd come to expect a certain unflagging resiliency from her. But now, her shoulders were drooping, like the weight of this place and the job they'd set for themselves was weighing down upon her. Poor Avery, though. She was a different matter altogether. She was soaked with sweat. He could tell it was sweat and not river water, because it was popping out all over her skin and running down her cheeks like tears, cutting clean scars through the dirt that covered her pink face. Every step she took looked like it was bought with pain. He wanted to reach out and touch her hand, tell her that, "Nate, stop," Sylvia said. He froze, shook the thoughts from his head. He turned around. The others were 3 or 4 steps behind him. Richardson nodded down the hallway. The little girl in the yellow dress was about to round a brightly lit corner. Nate could see a flickering orange light spilling across the floor there, setting the girl into relief. "Go quietly," Sylvia said. "No surprises." Nate nodded. They got to the corner in time to see 2 black shirts opening a large wooden door for the little girl. She walked through, still carrying the plastic bag full of bread and oranges, and never even looked at the 2 uninfected men. To Nate it was unbelievable. Zombies and humans working together like that. It seemed unreal. A few moments later, the little girl came back through the same door, turned to her left, and walked away down a side corridor. "That's pretty weird," Nate said. "I bet she's in there," said Avery. She was trying to be quiet, but the excitement in her voice was unmistakable. "I bet you're right," said Sylvia. She smiled and patted the younger woman on the shoulder. Sylvia was more restrained than Avery, but she too was giddy. These 2, they'd been through hell to find Nicky. Now they were like kids at Christmas, the anticipation almost too much to bear. But then Sylvia's smile wavered. "What?" Avery said. "We need to get in there somehow." Nate didn't like the sound of that. The two black shirts had machine guns. He pointed at the pistol at Richardson's hip. "Could you shoot them?" "I'd never get them both," Richardson said. "One of them, probably. I might even be able to get the second one with a lucky shot. But even if I killed them both, the noise would just bring more." Nate nodded. Sylvia said, "Well, there may be another way." "What are you thinking?" Richardson asked. She glanced down at the baton in her hand and seemed to be turning options over in her mind. "A diversion, I guess," she said at last. She looked at Nate. "Do you think you could fool those guys long enough to turn their backs to me? Fool them?" Richardson chuckled softly, shaking his head. "What?" Nate said. He was starting to get angry. "You sure look the part," Richardson said. "I think it could work." "The part? What the hell are you guys talking about?" "It's okay," Richardson said. He pulled his blackjack from the waistband of his jeans. "Here," he said, handing it to Nate. "Take this. Palm it as long as you can, tucked up into your sleeve." He showed Nate how to hold it out of sight. "There, like that." Nate was utterly perplexed. "Don't worry," Richardson said. "I know what she has in mind." Nate stepped into the open, certain he was about to get shot. This was stupid. He struggled to put some label on how he felt, but the only word that came to mind was transparent. Nate didn't know if that was right or not, but it felt right. He did know that these black shirts would have to be idiots to mistake him for one of the zombies. Shuffling toward them, dragging his feet, arms at his side, Nate watched the men without trying to make it look like he was watching them. He turned what he hoped was a dead stare on a spot somewhere near the middle of the door between them, letting his head loll and jerk, his mouth hanging open just a little. The black shirts weren't expecting anything. That much was obvious from the way they tensed, hands flexing on their weapons, the nervous glances that passed between them. But Nate ignored them. He got to the middle of the hallway and turned slowly to his right. He started walking. He made it a few steps into the new hallway when one of the guards said, "What the hell is that all about?" Nate stopped. He let a moan escape his throat. One of the guards had been about to speak, but quickly smothered the sound. Nate slowly turned his head, just as he'd seen countless zombies do during his wanderings. A runner of drool gathered at the corner of his mouth and fell down his chin. Nate fought back the instinct to wipe it away. He took a lurching step toward the guard, and he hoped the vacant look in his eyes was believable. He would find out any second now, he supposed. "Ah, shit," the guard said. He slid the machine gun off his shoulder as his partner came around to stand next to him. But before either man could raise his weapon, Nate let the blackjack drop, his fingers settling into the leather strap. What happened next seemed to happen all at once. His arm came up, the blackjack raised high. The first guard's eyes widened, almost comically. The blackjack came down on the man's chin, accompanied by the sickening crack of lead on bone. The man sagged to the floor. Sylvia erupted from the shadows, swinging her baton at the back of the second guard's head. Nate looked down at the first guard, who was writhing lamely on the carpeted floor, groaning in pain. Nate knelt down, his knees either side of the first guard's chest. He brought the blackjack down again and again on the man's face, smashing it to a bloody pulp. When Nate rose from the man's corpse, he had blood on his hands and in his eyes. He coughed, not quite believing what he'd just done, and then laughed. "He did it," he said. "Did you see that? They actually fell for it." Sylvia pushed him out of the way. "Come on, there isn't much time." She opened the door the guards had been covering and went inside. Avery and Richardson followed. And, after a pause, so did Nate. Just enough light spilled in from the doorway for Nate to see the outlines of a bell-shaped cage hanging from the ceiling. It was empty, and the floor below looked wet. He couldn't tell for sure, though, and he didn't want to find out. The others were just ahead of him, moving around the cage, giving it a wide berth. "I have a penlight," Richardson said. "Should we chance it?" Sylvia stopped and looked back. Her eyes caught the light, flashing like a cat's in the dark. "Yeah," she said. "Go ahead." Nate was standing right behind Richardson when he turned his tiny blue LED light into the darkness. He saw a flash of movement, a woman, battered and snarling, moving fast. She lashed out at Richardson, the heel of her hand smashing into Richardson's nose, sending him flying backward. The penlight hit the floor and rolled away. Nate was watching it when an iron grip locked onto his throat, fingernails digging deep into his skin. He couldn't breathe. Whoever had him was holding him from behind. He started to thrash. His resistance earned him a kick to the back of his knees. He collapsed, but not all the way to the floor, for his captor had grabbed his left arm and twisted it up behind his back. The grip on his throat slackened for just a moment. "Stop it!" Nate said. The grip tightened. Then a woman leaned in close to his ear and whispered, "Stop fighting me or I'll tear the windpipe from your throat." He tried to speak and couldn't. He nodded instead. A little pressure came off his throat, but at the same time his captor bent his arm farther up his back. Nate arched his back against the pain, a little whimper escaping his lips. "Please stop," he said. "Who are you?" "I'm Nate Royal." She wrenched his arm even farther up his back. "I want to know why you're here. Answer me." But before Nate could speak, Sylvia grabbed the penlight and turned it up at her own face. "Nicky, it's me." Nate was thrown roughly to the floor. He landed on his chin with an audible oomph and stayed there. It felt like his arm had been pulled out of its socket and his throat crushed. It took him a long while before he could sit up. When he did, he saw Sylvia and Avery and the woman they called Nicky hugging. Avery was crying. Sylvia looked like a worried mother. She couldn't take her hands off Nicky's wounded face. She kept saying, "Oh, sweetie. Oh, no, don't you worry. We'll get you out of here." Nate finally rose to his feet. His eyes had adjusted to the dark now, and he could see the three women in shadowed relief. He saw Nicky turn his way, and there was just enough light to see the distrust on her face. "Who's that?" she said. "His name is Nate," Avery said. Even Nate could recognize the hopeful timbre in her voice, as though she hoped Nicky might offer some encouraging words about him. Nate couldn't help but feel a touch of pride. He was 30 years old, but he couldn't ever remember being the cause of making a woman sound like that. Nicky, too, it seemed, picked up on it. She regarded Nate with a look he couldn't quite articulate, but it felt like he was being summed up, evaluated in some way. It made him feel all of about 2 feet high. "I think your friend is hurt," Nicky said. Nate nodded. "Uh-huh. You might want to help him," Nicky prodded. "Oh, yeah." Nate went over to Richardson and knelt by his side. He examined Richardson's face, the smashed nose and upper lip, the blood, the missing front tooth. "Wow, she fucked you up good." Richardson groaned. He tried to sit up, but his eyes crossed and he sagged back to the ground. "Can you stand?" After a moment, Richardson nodded. Nate helped him to his feet. The women were standing in a huddle a short distance away, Sylvia and Avery both trying to talk at once. Nicky noticed him, and her bruised smile receded. "Is your friend okay?" "My friend?" Nate didn't catch her meaning. He was too busy looking at her face. In the low light, it was difficult to make her out clearly, but Nate thought she might have been pretty before she got beat up. Her eyes were blackened and puffy, her lips crusty with dried blood. Her left shoulder drooped, like she was too tired or too badly hurt to stand up straight. "What happened to you?" he said. Nicky huffed. "Your boyfriend's not the brightest bulb in the box, is he?" "He's not my boyfriend," Avery said, though she wouldn't look any of them in the eye. Though he couldn't be sure, Nate was certain he saw a high blush rise in her cheeks. "I'm all right," Richardson said. "Well, okay then," Nicky said. She extended her right foot and shook it, so they could all hear the chain cuffed to her ankle rattling. "Somebody got a flat piece of metal? A screwdriver, maybe?" A pause. "I do," said Richardson. He urged Nate to one side, hesitantly standing on his own. "I got it," he said. He reached into the back pocket of his jeans and pulled out a flat strip of metal about the size of a well-chewed pencil. It had a little squiggly hook at the end. Nate squinted at it, then looked questioningly at Richardson. "It's a lockpick. On my way to the grasslands, I traveled with this ex-cop named Michael Barnes. He said he used to carry one of these in his back pocket all the time, just in case somebody handcuffed him." "That'll work," Nicky said. "Here, give it to me." Richardson handed the lockpick over. Nate stepped forward, instantly fascinated. He'd always found it mystifying that people could manipulate things the way they did. Even back before the world got all messed up, the sight of somebody working on an engine, or installing cable on a new entertainment center, or turning some old appliance into something completely new and clever, was a mystery to him. Machines and electronics were like some puzzle too strange and too big for him to fathom. He was completely incapable of doing it himself, but it still fascinated him. Like Nicky Booth was fascinating him now. She was digging the pick into the gap between the cuff's ratchet arm and base, her bruised lips pursed in concentration. The cuff clicked open. Nicky kicked the metal away, then went down on one knee to rub her ankle where the cuff had chafed her. She got back up quickly. In the faint blue glow of the penlight, Nate could see the dark bruises on her cheeks, the dried blood at her ears and down the sides of her neck, the missing tooth. She swayed uncertainly on her feet. Her captors had really hurt her. But despite the damage, there was an unmistakable aura of certainty and control about her. This one, Nate sensed, was tough. The red man had battered her, bruised her, but he hadn't gotten to her core. He hadn't been able to get that deep. There was still a hard grain inside her that was as of yet undaunted and true. "What day is it?" she said. It's Wednesday," said Avery. Nicky grunted. "We don't have much time. I'm supposed to meet Fisher at sunset." She touched Avery's hand lightly, and the younger woman looked up expectantly. "How you doing, baby? You okay?" Avery nodded. "It's good to see you again." "You too. Listen, I need you to help me. Do you know where we are? On the river, I mean." Avery nodded again. "Do you know how to get to a little town called Chester from here?" "Sure. It's only 14 miles south of here. We could just follow the east bank of the river." "That close? Really?" Nicky looked impressed. The faint glimmer of a smile appeared at the corner of her damaged mouth. "I'm supposed to meet Fisher there at St. Mary's Cemetery. You know it?" "You bet I do." Nicky looked at Sylvia, and the two women traded real smiles now. Nate heard something. Behind them. In the dark. Richardson was a few feet away, still bleeding, his breath coming in wet, nasally pulls through his busted lips. At first that was the noise Nate thought he'd heard, and he was about to turn back to the women when he saw a dark shape moving slowly across the ground just behind Richardson. Nate turned the penlight on it and let out a gasp. It was a man. Definitely a man, completely nude and covered in blood. Deep, oozing cuts ran down the length of his body, and some looked deep enough to show the yellow layers of fat beneath the skin. A wide smear of blood marked his relentless path through the darkness to this spot. But as injured as he was, the zombie moved with surprising speed. It extended a gnarled hand and locked it around Richardson's ankle. At the same time, he pulled his open mouth toward Richardson's calf and bit off a huge chunk of denim and flesh. Richardson screamed as he collapsed to the ground. Nate took a step in that direction, meaning to kick the zombie in the face to get him away from Richardson. But he had barely begun to move when he felt an iron grip on the back of his shirt. It was Nikki. She pulled him back, nearly throwing him to the ground in the process. "Get out of the way," she said. The zombie reached for her. She knocked his hand away, got behind him, and pushed the man face down on the pavement with the sole of her boot. He tried to clutch at her, but his movements were awkward, and he couldn't figure out how to turn his arms over to get a grip on her. Nikki gave him a solid kick in the ribs for good measure, then stood over the top of him and brought her boot down hard on the back of his neck. There was a loud crack, and the man went still. But Richardson was still screaming. "We need to keep him quiet," Nikki said. She took the penlight from Nate and turned it on Richardson. His face had gone pale, and his mouth was quivering. His eyes were wild with fright. The blue glow of the penlight made his skin look unnatural, like fine marble. He watched Nikki drawing closer, and he started shaking his head. "No," he said. "No. Stay back." "It's all right," she said. "Don't make any noise. I just want to look at you." "The crows," Richardson said. "No, please. Stay back." "The crows," Nikki said. She looked back at Nate, but he had no idea what Richardson was talking about. He shrugged. Somewhere in the darkness, they heard wet, gurgling moans. Lots of them. They all froze. Even Richardson stopped whimpering. "What was that?" Nate said. "Shh," Nikki hissed. She turned the penlight into the darkness. Nate strained his eyes to see into the shadows. There were figures moving around in little side rooms along the walls, some just rising to their feet, others already awake and surging against the chain-link fence that had been placed over the entrances to the rooms, turning them into cells. Out of habit, Nate tried to count them, but there were way too many for that. All he could see was a blur of ruined faces and shredded fingers, trying to squeeze through the diamond-shaped holes of the fence. One of the zombies tried to climb the fence, and the weight peeled the corner of it away from the wall. He fell and was trampled by the others surging forward, reaching for the opening that was getting wider with every second. A moment later, the fence tore loose from the wall, and soon dozens of zombies were stumbling across the floor, crunching the pile of trash beneath their feet. "Time to go," Nikki said. Nate knelt down next to Richardson and tried to lift him, but even he knew the older man was as good as dead. Richardson was already starting to convulse, a sure sign that the necrosis filovirus was waging war in his bloodstream, and winning. His eyes were rolling up into his head, and little specks of blood were already starting to appear on his lips. Nikki grabbed Nate by the shirt again and pulled. "Let's go," she said. "You can't help him now." Her grip was surprisingly strong. Even if he had tried to resist, he probably wouldn't have been able. "And she's injured, too," he thought. Such strength. "But Ben," Nate said. Nikki shoved him toward the door again. "Move," she said. "There's no time." Nate let himself be led out the door and into the hallway, where torches cast a flickering orange light on the black floor and the wood-paneled walls. He was still in shock, unable to resist. He looked into the darkness of the room they'd just left. The moaning was growing louder. and he could see the shambling forms of men and women moving toward the lighted doorway in which he stood. He knew he had to run. Behind him, the others were already heading down the hallway, but something inside him was telling him that this was huge, too huge to just walk away from. That was Ben Richardson in there. That was the man who had entrusted him with his life's work. A man was dying in there, and somebody had to pay attention. Ben Richardson, he thought, trying to wrap his mind around all that the man had come to represent for him. A new beginning. A purpose redefined. Not since Doc Kellogg had anyone ever bothered to talk to him, really talk to him about the way the world worked. But Richardson had. They had shared some conversations about this blighted world and how Nate might fit in with it. They had had such huge conversations. They had talked for hours on end. The man's words had been a gift to Nate, the kind of gift that saved lives. And now, Nate was left wondering why Richardson died, muttering something crazy about crows. It didn't make any sense. He couldn't quite come to terms with that. Chapter 20. "You okay?" Jimmy Hinton whispered. Gabby had slipped on the muddy bank and landed on her hands and knees. For a long moment she didn't move, so long that Jimmy almost asked her again if she was okay. But she finally looked up at him. "The ground here smells bad." "Yeah," he agreed. "It's an evil place." She stood up and shook the mud from her hands. It was a frustrated gesture, like she was trying to restore her pride, but it was a mood effort at this point. There was more mud on the front of her dress than there was on the ground. The shape of the stain, the way it spread in a semicircle across her lap, reminded Jimmy of an apron. That was funny, he thought. His Gabby wearing an apron. Their marriage, especially these last 8 years, had been as much about guns and keeping the Sugar Jane afloat as it was about love. This woman, who had meant so much to him, was anything but a domestic goddess. She didn't mouse about the boat, begging him to make their decisions for their survival. She didn't make the bed and cook his meals and cluck over him like an old mother hen. Instead, she killed zombies and river pirates alike, and she did it standing right by his side. There wasn't a trace of squeamishness in her. She didn't fear guns or engine grease or even the zombies that roamed this blighted land. Gabby Hinton was a battle-axe, and he loved her for it. He stifled a laugh. "What's so funny?" She was still trying to shake the mud from her hands. "Nothing," he said. She gave him a look like she didn't believe him, but let it pass. "Well, let's get moving. We aren't going to find a ride standing here." "Nope, I guess you're right about that." They were following a path of loose gravel that ran between the tall weeds that grew along the verge of the river and the muddy bank upon which Gabby had just fallen. It wasn't a true path. It was overgrown in spots, the gravel not even visible, but it offered the only cover they had this close to the river. The land that stretched out between the top of the muddy bank and the hotel was flat and empty of trees. There were a few rusted pickups and a boat trailer on the drive that led down to the pier, but nothing that could conceal them from the patrols wandering the grounds. They were stuck down here next to the river. Jimmy's goal was a small wooden shed about 30 yards ahead of them. He envisioned this hotel in its prime, with little boats rented out to guests puttering up and down the slow-moving majesty of the mighty Mississippi, and a dull-headed boy on his summer vacation working the shack, taking room keys and handing out pamphlets on the sights. Beyond the shack were a few of those small motorboats, and one or two looked like they might actually be sturdy enough to get them away from this place. Probably not very far, but far enough. "Can you make it to that shed?" he asked. She narrowed her eyes at him. "Okay, then," he said. He held up his palms in mock surrender as though he was sorry he asked. "Onward we go." When they reached it, Jimmy saw something he hadn't expected. On the other side of the shed was a concrete drive that sank into the river. Debris floating on the water seemed to be moving slowly, and it occurred to him that the combination of deep water and slow-moving currents made this a logical ferry crossing point. He looked across the river for a matching point on the other side, but the fog was still thick enough in places to obscure his view. He had a strong feeling it was there, though, and he kicked himself for his stupidity. The shack wasn't some kind of checkout line for hotel guests. It was the weather shack for the ferryboat drivers. That meant the Red Man would be bringing his boats in here, especially if he was going to be offloading zombies, which he almost certainly would be. "This is no good," Jimmy said. "We need to get back to the pier." "The pier? What for?" "As soon as that fog clears, I think we're gonna—" Jimmy stopped mid-sentence. Gabby didn't speak. The two of them had been partners long enough to recognize each other's cues, and she hunkered down, looking at him and waiting. He motioned to her that he heard something coming from the direction of the hotel. She fell back against the bank and pressed herself into the mud. Jimmy nodded in approval and crawled forward, peering over the lip of the bank. A guard was standing less than 10 feet away, his back to them. Jimmy gasped silently. If the man had been looking at them just then— "Give me a fucking break," the guard said. "I gotta piss." Jimmy quickly ducked down again, his eyes wide with panic. He motioned to Gabby in the sign language they'd developed over the years. "One guy, machine gun. We need to make that shack." Gabby nodded back in understanding. Together, they crawled through the weeds and over to the part of the shack that lipped over the river. Jimmy helped Gabby onto the deck, and the two of them hid inside an alcove facing the water. The inside of the shack was dingy and had the lingering smell of fish offal, as though it had so long been used to clean fish that the smell had settled into the wood like rot. They waited there, listening. Gabby was standing at one corner, her hands up, and the fingers curled over like claws. If that black shirt Jimmy had seen happened around that corner, he'd no doubt get his neck wrung like an old rooster in a farmyard. An apron indeed, he thought. He heard footsteps on the planks of the dock, and tensed. The guard— he was no more than a kid, Jimmy could see that now— stepped to the edge of the dock, his rifle slung casually over one shoulder, and unzipped his pants. A moment later he was jetting a steady stream of urine into the water. Jimmy put a hand on Gabby's shoulder, urging her back. She eased back into the alcove, but he could still feel the tension in her. She was ready to kill the guard. The next instant the young man shook, zipped up his fly, and went back to his patrol. Jimmy could hear his footsteps on the dock, and then in the mud as he slogged his way back up the bank. He let out a long breath. "You should have let me kill him," Gabby whispered. "I could have broken his neck before he had a chance to make a sound." "And then what?" "His buddies would come down and check on him." She didn't have an answer for that. "We can't stay here," he said. "You said that before." He nodded. "This is their landing spot. My guess is this is where they're going to come ashore." That stopped her. She studied the concrete drive, the slow-moving river, and he knew from the look on her face that she was coming to the same conclusion he had just a moment earlier. "What are we going to do?" she asked. "Is it clear?" She turned so that she was facing the shack, then slowly peered around the corner, up toward the hotel. Jimmy studied her lips, trying to read the words she was muttering. It looked like she was counting. "Not yet," she said. "I see 2 patrols, 8 men total. They're coming from opposite sides of the hotel. Both have a clear view of the bank." "Okay, then. We waited out here." She looked sharply at him. "You said we couldn't stay here." "We're probably safe as long as there's fog on the water. The Red Man will be out there searching as long as he can." "You're sure of that?" He wrinkled his brow.
Why wouldn't I be?
I was thinking about what Sylvia said.
What about it?
Do you think it's true? Can he really control zombies like they say?
I don't see why not. If he really is what they say he is, controlling zombies should be a piece of cake.
She didn't answer. Instead, she got a faraway look in her eyes, like she was going deep into her own head.
What's going on with you? He said. What are you thinking?
She smiled.
You know me pretty well, don't you?
I hope so, he said. After all we've been through, if I don't know you like I know my own soul, then I haven't been loving you like you deserve.
She blushed. He couldn't believe it. The battle axe blushed. There was a girl in there, delicate and true, and needing something just as honest from him.
You're wondering about our future,
he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded.
Beyond getting out of this?
She nodded again.
I was thinking about that moron, Nate Royal.
The redemption of mankind in the hands of a complete and utter dumbass.
She stifled the laugh in her throat.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it, about God working in mysterious ways?
Her smile faded.
God hasn't lived here in a while.
No, he said. I suppose you're right about that.
So what does that leave us with? We've got no God. The world is a blighted ruin inhabited by abominations. Our future is a huge question mark. And the only answer in sight is a man who probably doesn't deserve the air he breathes. Where does that leave us? What does it mean that we've hooked our anchor to him?
Jimmy looked out across the water. The fog was patchy, like the way smoke used to cling to the ceilings of bars back in the day. In the distance, he could hear birds squawking, fighting with one another, no doubt over carrion. This world had become that, after all. A carrion country. A land feeding upon itself, much as a cancer spread through the body. It was the kind of land a good man wept for. Jimmy had seen as much, time and time again. Men and women breaking down, unable to advance another step, even when that step was as meaningless as the one before it. They were in a land of sand and fog. They were pillars of stone on a wind-swept plain. But it remained to be seen how much erosion they could withstand.
We are survivors, he said. We've lost a lot, but as long as we're alive, the ones we loved will go on living. As far as I'm concerned, that's all that matters.
She looked up at him then, and he had no doubt that she loved him. It was written in her eyes. It was on her lips.
Where do we go from here?
I don't know,
he said.
That doesn't worry you?
It makes me wonder about our place in this world. I don't know if that's the same thing. I look at the world and I see desolation. I see a world that has turned into something I didn't expect, and that I don't especially like. But that doesn't necessarily make it wrong. Maybe this Nate Royal character really is the answer. Maybe he's the kind of man who's going to carry humanity forward into the world that's yet to be. He seems like a poor choice, if you ask me. Of course, I don't see anybody else standing in line to do that.
She paused, then asked,
Do you care?
About the world? About what happens from here?
She nodded.
I'm scared, he said. I want this Nate Royal guy to succeed. So yeah, I guess I do care. If he's the cure, then I definitely want him to succeed. I prefer a world of possibilities, even bad ones, to a world of madness.
Gabby reached forward and took his hand in hers.
I'm glad,
she said. The sound of a motor pulled his attention away. He looked back toward the river, where the fog was still patchy, but not nearly as thick as it had been just a few minutes before. The prow of a boat emerged from the fog. On the deck were a dozen zombies, all of them standing still and mute, like ghastly parodies of terracotta soldiers. The next instant, 3 more boats came into view.
"Shit," Jimmy muttered. "The red man's come back."
What do we do?
Jimmy looked around. They couldn't run to the hotel. Too many black shirts. They couldn't go into the water. He had counted at least 40 boats while they were fighting out on the river, and they'd have no chance of staying hidden in the water with that kind of fleet coming ashore.
Jimmy, they're getting close.
She was right. Even as he stood there considering their next move, the red man's fleet was nearing the boat ramp. Then he spotted a wooden bridge leading from the water up to the top of the bank. There was, maybe, 2 feet of clearance underneath. He pointed her toward it.
What about snakes?
She said.
"What?"
I'm not going under there. There might be snakes.
He remembered a time up around Herculaneum. A water moccasin had slithered aboard, and she had cornered it between a lawn chair and the Sugar Jane's gunwale. He remembered her screaming at the top of her lungs, all the while blasting holes in the deck with a 12-gauge as she tried to kill the snake. He didn't argue. He got down on his back and wriggled his way underneath the wooden bridge. When he was completely under, he gestured for her to follow. She wedged herself under the bridge and got close to him.
"You have enough room?"
"Yeah."
"Good,"
he said, like they were divvying up bedsheets. They waited. They heard men yelling orders and boats dragging bottom as they came ashore. Then everything went silent. Jimmy got scared for a second.
Something was wrong.
The only thing visible from where he and Gabby lay were a few bands of overcast summer sky through the slits between the boards. But he couldn't shake the image of a handful of troops rounding the edges of the bridge with their weapons raised, a look of smug satisfaction on their faces. But then, the first zombies came ashore. He could tell who they were by the slow, shuffling slide their feet made as they climbed the bridge. And they kept coming. Dozens. Hundreds. Their combined weight shook the bridge and rained bits of dirt down on their faces. It went on and on. He felt Gabby grab his hand and squeeze. He looked at her, saw the fear and worry there.
"We're okay,"
he whispered. A thin band of light illuminated her face. A shifting patchwork of shadows from the zombies passing overhead moved across her features, but they couldn't disguise the worry he saw there. Jimmy was uncertain how long it took the zombies to offload, but he guessed it was the better part of an hour. His back was aching, and his mouth hurt from clenching his teeth for so long. But at last it ended. The final zombie passed overhead, and then the sky was clear again. Gabby let out a sigh that sounded like a mountain of fear collapsing in on itself. Even Jimmy allowed himself a moment of thanks. But all that went away when he heard footsteps on the bridge. It was a man this time. Jimmy could tell from the deliberate step, the control. The man was coming down from the hotel side of the compound, and he stopped directly above Jimmy, so that they had a clear view of the bare-chested red man coming up from the river. "I got your transmission, sir, but we haven't found any signs they've been here."
"They're here."
There was a pause. The guard sounded like a man unwilling to point out the obvious to his superior. Finally, he said, "I ordered my men to search the hotel."
"Have they searched the holding cell?"
"I have guards standing by in front of her cell, sir."
"Have you talked with them?"
"Me? No. But they're 2 of my best men."
"Call them, right now."
The guard paused, then pulled a radio from his belt and keyed up. "Parker," he said, "you monitoring?" A pause. "Parker?" Nothing but silence. "McCullers, you listening?" Again nothing.
"Shit,"
the man said. He keyed up his radio again. "Stevenson, Lardner, Wharton, you guys head inside and check on Parker and McCullers. I want a report as soon as possible."
"That won't be necessary,"
the red man said.
They've already made their way ashore and found their way to Nicky Booth.
Sir, with all due respect—
What?
the red man asked. Jimmy had missed something, some exchange between the two, but he recognized the threatening tone in the red man's voice. The tone of menace and implied contempt in the red man's voice was unmistakable. "Sir," the guard said, "I'm sure we'll get them to answer up."
Me too,
the red man said. He had been drawing near the guard as he spoke, and he suddenly lashed out and bit the man's ear. There was a momentary struggle, two bodies shifting on the bridge's wooden planks, and then the red man came away with a piece of the guard's ear in his teeth. Blood dripped onto the bridge and through the gaps in the boards, landing on Jimmy's chest. He did his best to ignore the hot wetness that spread across his shirt, and also the pathetic screams of the wounded guard as he writhed in pain, his face soaked in blood. The red man wiped the blood from his lips and licked his fingers clean.
"I want Nicky Booth," he said, "and as many of the others as you can find. They are here somewhere. Find them!"
From somewhere close by, Jimmy heard a man say, "Yes, sir, we'll find them." But his eyes were glued to the black shirt, face down on the bridge. Jimmy shifted his gaze until he, too, was looking right at the injured man, right in his eyes, and he could see everything that ever mattered about the man, ebbing away into nothingness. Chapter 21. 3 zombies stumbled out of the darkened doorway. The first 2 were women, who had been reduced to walking wrecks. Bloody, open sores on their faces and arms, dried blood caked in their hair, hands trembling as they clutched the empty air in front of them. It was their hands that Nate noticed. The fingernails were too long, 3 inches at least. They were cracked and filthy, the knuckles swollen. He had seen a group of people in New Mexico years earlier dying of starvation in the desert. Their hands had looked like that, trembling and fragile and horrible, but without the long fingernails. Behind the women was a young black man pulling himself along on half a leg. He hobbled badly. It slowed him down, but he looked far stronger than the 2 women, like maybe he had fed recently. He would be trouble if Nate let him get too close. One of the women reached out for him, slashing her nails across his face with surprising force for someone so rickety-looking. Nate flinched from the pain. He touched his face and his hand came away bloody. "Bitch!" he said. He made a fist and was about to lay her out with a haymaker when a hand grabbed the back of his shirt and pulled him out of the way.
"What the hell are you doing?" Nicky said. "We don't have time for this."
She had put herself between him and the approaching zombies and stood coiled, perfectly balanced, like a professional fighter. The same woman who had scratched Nate's face tried it on Nicky, but this time she didn't connect. Instead, Nicky grabbed the woman's wrist with her left hand, pulled the zombie's arm straight, and with the heel of her right hand, struck hard on the back of the zombie's elbow. The arm broke with a sickening crunch, but the zombie didn't cry out. She didn't even grunt. Her expression didn't even change. The lips were still pulled back, exposing cracked and broken teeth. The eyes never blinked. Nicky spun her around and planted her boot into the back of the woman's leg, driving her to her knees. Then she kicked her into the other 2 zombies, knocking them all to the floor. Nicky turned on Nate.
"Get moving! I've got this!"
Nate backed away, amazed at how Nicky moved. She had the grace of a featherweight boxer. The young black man had gone down with the 2 women, but he didn't stay down. He threw them to the side, rose up on his one good leg, and reached for Nicky. He looked strong enough that he might have been able to snap her neck if he'd been able to get close enough. But Nicky was faster. She grabbed his wrist, much as she'd done with the other zombie, but rather than pull his arm straight, she twisted the wrist over backward, doubling the man's arm up on top of his shoulder. At the same time, she spun him around so that he was facing away from her. She didn't give him a chance to readjust. She grabbed his chin in one hand and his hair in the other, and gave his head a brutal twist. There was an audible crack, and then his body sagged to the floor. Nate's mind was still trying to catch up with what she'd done when she started shoving him down the hallway.
"Come on," she said. "Move it."
Nicky and Sylvia took the lead. Nate and Avery fell back a few steps, following them down one darkened hallway after another. He could hear the zombies behind them, moaning in the dark.
"I thought we would have lost them by now,"
Avery said in a low whisper. Nate nodded.
"Ben's back there."
It was finally catching up with him, the fact that they'd left Ben back there to die. Nate felt sick to his stomach.
"Oh, Nate, I'm so sorry."
She took his hand in hers and gave it a light squeeze. Nate looked down at her hand in surprise. He didn't know what to say, so he just gritted his teeth and nodded again. He had never been any good at things like this. He had no skill at describing how badly he was hurting inside. Nate wished he could tell her that having her here, next to him, even in this place, somehow made the pain a little easier to bear. But he didn't have the words for that either. They rounded another corner, and the hallway opened up onto a landing. Beyond the landing was a railing that looked down over the hotel's main lobby. Outside, lightning flashed, brightening the windows. Already they could see drops of water speckling the glass. But they could hear something else moving down below. They went over to the railing to investigate. Light was filtering in through the front door, and long shadows stretched across the parquet floor and the marble fountain in the middle of the room. And then zombies poured in through the front door. They kept coming and coming, tracking vast quantities of mud across the floor.
"There are hundreds of them,"
Nate said. Nicky tried to shush him by grabbing his arm, but the damage was already done. A few of the zombies had hurt him, and one by one the zombies all looked up. The next instant, the moans started.
"Nice move, jackass,"
Nicky said. Nicky stared over the railing toward the landing on the opposite side of the lobby. There was a staircase there, and a few of the zombies were already mounting it.
"Well, we're not going out the front door," she said. "Avery, got any ideas?" "Where do you want to go?" "Can you get us to the convention center part of the hotel? When they brought me in, I remember seeing a loading bay over there. They have trucks. Maybe they have one there we could take. Might be an easy way to get us out of here."
A stuttering moan behind them caused Nicky to turn toward the stairs. A man was staggering toward them on a broken leg, his bare feet leaving a smear of blood on the wood floors. A large crowd was massing behind him, their eyes glinting in the dark.
"Which way, Avery?"
Nicky said. Avery pointed to the far side of the balcony, opposite the stairs.
"Through that hallway over there. Is there a stairwell that way?" "I think so. There are elevators over there. The stairs are probably next to those."
"Good."
"I don't understand," Nate said. "I thought you were looking for the convention center." "Don't you ever shut up," Nicky said. "I'm just asking." "Look, we've got zombies behind us and zombies in front of us, but none above us."
She waited for him to say something. One eyebrow arched.
"You understand? Any of this sinking in?"
She paused.
"Oh, forget it."
She turned to Sylvia.
"This is turning into a hell of a rescue."
They got to the stairs and went up to the third floor. A few zombies managed to climb the stairs behind them, but they weren't able to keep up, and soon Nicky was leading them through darkened hallways, past rooms that hadn't been occupied in at least 8 years, probably longer. They reached the convention center part of the hotel a few minutes later. Though the walls were grimy with years of river rot and humidity, most of the signage was still in place, and it didn't take long to find the loading dock, which was a large cement bay, like a subterranean parking garage, only crowded with stacks of moldering wooden pallets and 55-gallon drums.
"Look at that," Nicky said. "See that truck?"
They were standing at the mouth of a hallway that gave on the back of the bay. From their position, they could see a big black pickup truck near the overhead doors of one of the docks.
"That looks like one of the same trucks they were driving when they surprised us in St. Louis," Sylvia said.
"Yeah," agreed Nicky. "At least we know they work." Sylvia asked,
"So how do we do this?"
"We've got to get that overhead door open. After that, we'll see what's what. I think most of the activity's probably going to be down by the river, and if that's the case, then we should be able to get a good head start in that truck. Enough that we might be able to lose whoever they sent after us."
"If that thing's got gas, you mean?"
Nicky gave Sylvia a broad smile.
"Come on, Sylvia. A little confidence. We got this."
Nicky trotted across the bay. The others followed along behind her, but at a cautious distance. Nate's head was on a swivel, looking around for signs of movement and a place to take cover if anything happened. He had never liked playing soldier like this.
"Take that side,"
Nicky told Sylvia. He turned to Avery.
"You two are going to have to ride in the back. That okay?"
But before either of them had a chance to answer, Sylvia let out a curse.
"What is it?"
Nicky asked. She moved around to the passenger side of the truck, where Sylvia was standing, and her shoulders sagged.
"Damn it,"
she said.
"What's wrong?"
Avery asked.
"No front wheel on this side. They've got it up on a jack."
"Oh," said Avery. Nate looked from one woman to the next.
"So what do we do?" "I guess we're back to the original plan," Nicky said.
She turned to Sylvia.
"You said you had a boat?" "It was boarded out on the river, but the two people who brought us here are trying to get us a boat." "You brought somebody with you?"
"Who?"
"Jimmy and Gabby Hinton. Their boat's the Sugar Jane." "The Hintons? The same ones who dumped all that beef they were transporting for our compound?"
"Yeah," said Sylvia. Nicky shook her head.
"Unbelievable. This just keeps getting better and better." "Right now they're the only hope we've got," Avery said.
"I know, Avery," Nicky said. She put a hand on her cousin's shoulder.
"I know. We have to get out of here first, though."
Nicky scanned the wall where the overhead doors were.
"No smaller doors," she said. "We're going to have to risk cracking open one of these bigger ones. I don't want to risk opening it up all the way, though. Everybody okay with crawling under?"
They all nodded.
"Okay."
She went over to the nearest door and had her hand out to turn the handle when the door lurched and slowly started to rise. Nicky froze. One by one, all the doors down the line started to rise as well. Sunlight and rain poured in through the openings. Nate could see legs, and then torsos, and finally the shadowed faces of hundreds of zombies waiting to pour through the doors. Behind them, far behind them, were the Red Man soldiers, riding in black pickups like the one they'd just tried to steal. Even through the rain, Nate could see the startled looks on the black shirts' faces.
"Run!"
Nicky screamed. She was pointing wildly toward a rusting metal staircase along a side wall.
"Up there! Hurry! Go!"
They ran for it, mounting the stairs just ahead of the first of the zombies. Avery was just ahead of Nate. She was taking the stairs one at a time, her legs pumping hard, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. One of the zombies hit him hard from behind, and he tumbled forward, falling into Avery, knocking her face first into the stairs. The zombie was on Nate's back, clawing at him, ripping his shirt, tearing at the skin on his back. The pain was intense, like being scratched with burning wire, and he screamed. When he opened his eyes again, he could see Avery beneath him. Mangled hands were trying to reach around him to grab her, but he raised himself up to a push-up position and shielded her with his body. "Run!" he screamed. The staircase was shaking badly, and more bodies were piling on top of him. He could feel his arms getting weak. He couldn't hold it.